I don't like the 1980s. Don't tell them I said that, but it isn't exactly a secret. Was I alive during the 1980s? Thankfully, no. But that hasn't stopped me from forming some pretty strong opinions about the cultural output of the entire decade, at least in the United States. That's why we haven't covered very many 1980s movies on this channel, and why I almost turned this 1980s movie off after about 5 seconds. Even before you get to the part of the movie where you see things, you know it's the 80s, because you hear that music, you hear the reverb on the snares of Wang Chung. It was almost too much for me, even just that. Thankfully, I stuck it out, because I think that To Live and Die in LA, it's actually a cool movie. It's an interesting movie, certainly. It's marked by the style of the 1980s, without a doubt. And I mean, just wait until you see the opening credits. It almost seems like a parody of an 80s movie at times. This movie is on the nose, but maybe being on the nose isn't a problem. To Live and Die in LA is directed by William Friedkin. That's the guy who directed The Exorcist and Sorcerer. Those are 1970s movies, but they are also kind of on the nose in a strangely compelling way. The Exorcist is from the 70s, but that's an aggressive movie, and so is this one. It's an interesting movie. Is it an 80s movie, or is it a movie about the 80s? Both? We'll have to see. It turns out that To Live and Die in LA is a interesting movie. Even the opening credits are kind of interesting. We get some shots of masked dancers stitched in between the sunset views of the Los Angeles skyline. Is this Friedkin shoving some ambiguity down our throats? Or is there really something to think about here? Well, we'll see. Before we get too far into things, let me talk about the cast for a minute. Willem Dafoe is probably going to get all the headlines here. Behind him, William Peterson and John Pankow and Jane Leeves are in the movie, but they might not be that well known outside of television. Jane Leeves played Daphne Moon in Frasier, for instance. Frasier coming back, thank God. Of course, the movie came out in 1985, and at the time, not even Willem Dafoe was particularly well known. He looks really young in this movie, and he'd been in fewer than 10 films, I think. It wasn't until Platoon came out the year later. This is 1985, that was 1986. That's 1 year later. It wasn't until it came out that his career really would have started to take off, more in the late 80s. I wasn't that excited about the cast at first, although I do like Willem Dafoe. But then John Turturro and Dean Stockwell showed up. If you like movies, then you've got to be a fan of Dean Stockwell. And John Turturro's character is great in this movie. He's got a bit more metal than you would expect. Unless you've seen a lot of other John Turturro movies, then you might expect exactly how things turn out. Robert Downey Sr. is also in the film. This is a movie about counterfeiting. We'll talk about the significance of this later, don't worry. Willem Dafoe plays a counterfeiter, and Pankow and Peterson play Secret Service agents. You might think of the Secret Service as the guys who protect the president and other dignitaries, possibly YouTube stars. But the Secret Service was actually founded in 1865 to crack down on counterfeiting. They didn't start protecting the president until 35 years later. And even today, the Secret Service still does a bunch of stuff with counterfeiting. Well, they don't do stuff with counterfeiting. They do things against it. Until 2003, the Secret Service was actually part of the Treasury Department. Anyway, this movie starts out with the Secret Service protecting somebody. The agent at the center of the film, Richard Chance, that's his name, is in the hotel where a president or governor, someone is staying, and he sees something a little bit fishy in the hall. He chases this guy around a bit and uncovers a Muslim suicide bomber. This is a really conspicuous beginning to the movie. In some ways, it doesn't have much to do with the rest of the film, but it reminds me a little bit of the beginning of The Exorcist. The Exorcist opens up in Egypt. Again, it's not totally clear why. Why in both these movies, we're starting out with sort of this allusion to the Arabic-speaking world. Bit weird. Friedkin doesn't hesitate to put anxiety on screen, I guess. I'm not really sure what the salience of terrorism was in the 1980s. Perhaps the beginning is hinting more generally at globalism, with this strange reference unmooring the film from domestic morality. The movie also ends with an allusion to some different contemporary anxiety. I won't spoil for you, but it's interesting stuff. Is Friedkin poking fun at these anxieties? Is it a sly subversion? I think maybe in the end, possibly, but the beginning is is a bit confusing to me. If you have any thoughts about it, put them down there. To Live and Die in LA reminds me of two movies that I've already reviewed on this channel. One is Point Blank, and the other one is Night Moves. The first one's from the 1960s, and the other one is from the 1970s. Stylistically, they don't have that much in common with this movie, but at a high level, they are all stories of investigations. In particular, they're investigations where the closer you look, the more you investigate, the further you get from solving the case. There's a deep sense of disillusionment in these movies. When I watched Point Blank and Night Moves, I thought both of them were presaging postmodernism. When we arrive at the 80s with To Live and Die in LA, well, I'm sorry, but it's unavoidable. We're going to have to talk about postmodernism because that's what really defines this movie. I mentioned the counterfeiting already. That's a square in postmodern bingo. Copying stuff. Beyond that, it's a war over who can copy stuff and how. Interesting. Willem Dafoe's character wanted to be an artist, but he found himself in the copying business instead. It's a business that unites him with all kinds of people. Apparently, Friedkin really wanted accurate depictions of counterfeiting in the film, so they found some experts in it to help them make the movie, and they made counterfeit for the movie that actually entered circulation and caused headaches for the Secret Service. Who knows if that's actually true, but it's interesting that Friedkin would tell the story so many times and that he would be almost proud of having done this sort of rebellious thing. He became a counterfeiter. Some ways investing in the salience of copying. Interesting. I do think this copying subplot, though, is a little bit facile, to be honest, so I'm not going to talk about it much more. I think a more salient film in the theme is the blurring of lines. This might sound even more facile, even more vague, but it shows up all over the movie, and I think there's something to work with here. At a high level, we see how the line between right and wrong has been erased. It's not that the characters don't know what is right and what's wrong. It's not that there's some deep moral dilemma, so much as that they don't really seem to care about what is right and what is wrong. Now, on its own, a story about cops who bend the rules is really nothing special at all. There's a ton of movies like that. But this idea shows up in more subtle ways as well. For instance, after the film's opening sequence, we see Agent Chance standing on a huge bridge. He's looking down pensively at the water, and then he steps off the bridge. It isn't until he's falling that we see there's a cable attached to his leg. He's bungee jumping, I guess. Here, we seem to have blurred the line between leisure and peril. We're living in some state of heightened attention in the 1980s. Extreme sports, leisure and peril colliding. Later, we see Chance's relationship with a woman. Is she his girlfriend? No, she's an informant that he continuously threatens with a parole violation. Here, we're erasing a line between romance and exploitation. A bit later on, we meet Willem Dafoe's girlfriend. Dafoe likes to film himself making love with her or her making love with other people. Sex on television is a hallmark of 1980s movies, whether it's the movie with the leg crossing, Basic Instinct, or something more interesting like Videodrome. Sex on television is again a collision of two ends of a spectrum, where one thing is very intimate and private, personal, and the other thing, this broadcast television, broadcast technology and infrastructure is very public. The public and the private coming together, the traditional and the modern coming together, sex on television. So, to me, I think this movie goes way beyond a story of cops bending the rules and shows us a world where institutions have eroded, a world where things are frequently mistaken for their opposites. Anyway, before we get too far down the rabbit hole, it's worth mentioning that this is an action movie. This is a fun movie. Why are we talking about all this random stuff? This is a good movie to watch. It's compelling. It's fun. There's a huge car chase in the middle of it. Great car chase, one of the best ones I've ever seen. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to drive the wrong way on the highway in Los Angeles? Turns out it's stressful, kind of like driving the right way on the highway in Los Angeles. This is a violent movie, but it does an interesting thing with the stylization of violence. Some of the harsh moments really are stylish. People stab people and then they strike a pose. They look cool while they're shooting one another. At other times, though, everybody involved just seems a bit stressed out. Again, stress, this heightened state that the 1980s puts you in, this heightened state that the city puts you in. During the car chase, one of the agents is locked in, like an action hero. This is Chance. The other one is freaking out, doesn't know what to do. Another thing that's interesting about this movie is how anonymous so many of the parties and the organizations in it are, so many of the people. The Secret Service probably does have a well-defined structure in real life, but I don't think the average person knows what it is. It's not like the police force, where people have heard of a police chief or something like that. It's not like the military, where people might generally have some concept of the different ranks. In this movie, the internal dynamics of the Secret Service play out a bit like Office Space. There is some kind of vague hierarchy, some idea about partnership, but it's not really clear who these people are or how the politics work or what their mandate is. They don't have a fancy bureau to work out of, but a nondescript office complete with cubicles. On the other side, we have the counterfeiters. Oh, there's a great moment, I should say, speaking of this sort of bureaucracy. There's a great moment where after this car chase, the car is like completely bashed up and they say, oh, well, don't worry, we'll just replace the back window. We lucked out, we just replaced the back window and then we'll return it to the motor pool. Return it to the motor pool. Talk about bureaucracy. I mean, in almost every police film where there's a car chase, you don't really hear them discussing, well, what forms are we going to have to fill out to explain this one, right? But in this movie, we do. Interesting that there's this sort of banality, mundaneness of the Secret Service. It's a bureaucracy. Anyway, there's also the counterfeiters on the other side of things, who are part of a very loose underground network. In a lot of movies about crimes, hierarchy is important on both sides, right? When things go wrong, the boss is going to hear about it. The orders come down from the chief of police or from Don Vito Corleone or possibly Michael Corleone. Here, we don't have that at all. The characters are kind of unmoored. One thing that we do have is layers. The Secret Service has run-ins with the FBI, for instance. They have run-ins with the cops at the airport. You might think that these people would all be on the same page, would all be in an alliance, but this isn't the case at all. Willem Dafoe crosses paths with different slices of the underworld, white-collar criminals and gangs. Something is happening here where society is being sliced up not in a way that makes sense, but along some other lines. When To Live and Die in LA came out, I think it was somewhat underappreciated. Some reviewers thought it was too violent. Some wondered why there weren't any likable characters, not even close, really. I think that this movie maybe has gotten better with time. In some ways, it maybe does feel like a modern movie looking back at the 1980s. Like I said, a movie about the 1980s or a 1980s movie. During any one era, there are a lot of movies that coexist. There are movies that lean wholeheartedly into the tropes of the time, and there are others that deconstruct them intellectually or that lampoon them comedically. Most things are somewhere in between these two poles, or maybe they're at both ends of the spectrum at once. To Live and Die in LA is certainly somewhere in between this. People are probably going to react to this movie in different ways. You can read it as a straight-up action film, I guess, but to me, I think there's more there. And the things that I thought about it, the things I liked about it were the pieces that were interesting. I mentioned some of these already, but it's really just the tip of the iceberg. You've got other moments with the masks, again, like this sort of dance thing. The geography of the city is another very interesting part of this movie. We get a couple glances at the skyline in the beginning, but then after that, we don't really get any geographical coherency in the film. We do take a trip down the LA River at one point. The river, the highway, the bridge, these things kind of structure the movie, but we don't really see like neighborhoods or any structure, any coherence, which is basically what it's like to be in LA, as I've experienced it, at least. There's an interesting fatalist sort of thread to the movie. I mean, that comes straight out of the title, but really fits in all the way through. There's a lot of different things to talk about with this movie. Of course, I wouldn't really call it an intellectual film, and it's possible that the criticisms about Friedkin turning everything up to 11, about the movie being too violent, about it being too extreme, maybe those also apply to these glimmers of intellectual interest that find their way into the movie. Is this really an interesting movie? Or is it just a movie that's made to look like an interesting movie? I mentioned the opening credits. They're extreme, and they cut these sort of characters, these masked dancers, they cut them into the opening credits here and there, and it, to me, felt a little bit contrived. Like they're trying to shove some form of substance, some form of artistic sophistication into the film at all costs. But the movie is, as I've said, pretty interesting. So it turns out the line is a bit blurry. And, one of the fun things about the postmodern films, the postmodern era, is almost always they fit into the mold that they're also describing. This thing about different ends of the spectrums colliding also applies to the movie itself completely. A movie that has probably some intellectual interest, but that also is kind of a very superficial, sleazy film. And those two aspects have collapsed into each other and are basically completely inseparable. That's kind of the point in some ways. Did Friedkin intend this? I don't know, but he is speaking the language of the time, certainly, and I think that there is something incisive here, a movie that is incisively fluent in the language of the 1980s. Of course, I set out by saying that I don't like the 1980s. Is this the ultimate 80s movie? That's what some people have called it, the ultimate 80s action movie. Maybe. Is it more? I don't know. Is it possible that the ultimate 80s movie actually does have some charms and actually is good? I think it is. Either way, I enjoyed To Live and Die in LA. It's not exactly my usual thing, but I do like Friedkin, and he has delivered once again.